So let's get started. So each chapter will have 4 or 5 videos, 5 to 6 minutes. I recommend watching them. I'll try to add a little bit to each chapter. And of course, definitely read the chapter either before you watch the videos or after you watch the videos. So what is chapter 1 all about? It's really about trying to understand how different the last 300 years are compared to what happened before. All right. So this is a measure of GDP per capita. Basically, GDP is all the value of everything we produce in a year, and GDP per capita just takes that number and divides it by the population. And so this has it for 5 different countries: Britain, Japan, Italy, China, and India. And you can see that up until about 1650, 1700, everything was just flat, right? There was really no increase in GDP per capita until about 1700, maybe 1650 in Britain. And so the question that we're going to try to ask and answer in these first 2 chapters is, how did that happen? And what was the role of capitalism? What was the role of technology? What were the role of the various institutions that governments put in place? And another thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that some countries grew earlier than others, and what can countries do to try to catch up to the richest countries like Britain and Japan or the United States. So, what we'll talk about in this chapter, we're going to talk about economic inequality and divergence. We'll see that with growth, we see also a big increase in inequality, both across countries and within countries. We'll talk about the role of technology and how that impacts growth, and then the role of capitalism. And what we'll see is that capitalism and technology really work together in order to provide the right incentives for an economy to grow. And we'll also see that the government plays a key role in making sure a capitalist economy has the right institutions in order to grow, but also that there's a number of different ways that governments have been put in place in order to manage growth and make things more or less equal. So this is a picture of income inequality in 3 different years for all countries. And what you can see, we'll walk through this in a separate video down below. But what you can see is that even in 1980, most of the world was still very poor, right? And so what we have is, along the horizontal axis, we have the poorest country to the richest country, right? So China and India are down here, the United States and Norway are up here. And then going backwards along the z-axis is inequality within the country. So you can see in China there was not a lot of inequality within the country because there were really no rich people. Whereas in the United States in 1980, there already were a fair number of rich people, and so there was more inequality, but even the poorest were in a much better position than in a really poor country like China and India. In 1990, more countries started to grow. And by 2014, a lot of countries had started to grow. And so you can see that the richest people in a lot of countries had really started to get higher income. But this poor in those countries were still quite poor. One of the biggest differences between 1980 and 2014 is where China is, right? So you can see China is now a middle income country, whereas in 1980 they were a poor country. And we'll talk about some of the institutions that China put in place in order to help themselves grow. So if we look at, 1,000 years ago, the world was flat. And basically before that, the world was still flat. There were some relatively rich people, right? So the kings and nobles and emperors, etc. But there wasn't a huge amount of difference between Europe and Asia and Africa and the Americas. Today, there are big differences between countries in those places. And there's big income inequalities within those countries too, right? So we have some people who have astronomical incomes and wealth, and that's going to be one of the things that we're going to explore in this class. So we can think about the uh, hockey stick diagram as that flat income that then increases, right? So we're going to talk about that some. Um, and so income really didn't start to grow. If we think of GDP per capita as one measure of a living standard in a country, right? It's not the only measure. It's not necessarily even the best measure, but it's one measure. For a very long time, those didn't grow. And we'll see in chapter 2 that, an economist named Thomas Malthus said it can't grow. It's impossible. Unfortunately, he was writing it right at the time that it was starting to take off. So he is remembered as someone who was right for the past but wrong for the future, like a lot of us are. Um, then we started to grow, right? The UK really started first in the middle of the 17th century, then other places in Western Europe, the United States, Japan. Uh, Other countries have only started to grow recently, right? So India and China are the two biggest examples. But we have the other East Asian tigers, places like Taiwan, uh, Indonesia, Thailand are all starting to grow. But other countries have still struggled. So a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is still relatively flat. So how do we measure income and living standards? Well, the main measure that we're going to talk about in macroeconomics is gross domestic product. And that's a measure of everything that we produce in an economy in a given year. And so we usually express it in per capita terms because that's the best way to compare countries, right? So can compare a country with 320 million, like the United States, with a country that has over 1 billion people, like China and India. We'll also talk about disposable income, right? So disposable income is really what matters to the household, which is how much market income they have, minus how much they have to pay in taxes, plus whatever they get in government transfers, right? It could be Social Security payments, unemployment benefits, food stamps, all of that stuff would be government transfers. They're both measures of well-being or living standards. They're both imperfect, and we're going to talk about both of them in more detail and things they do measure and things they don't measure. So let's talk about GDP first. So when we measure GDP for a given year, we measure something called nominal GDP. When we say something is nominal, we mean that its value is measured in current prices. And so nominal GDP basically is saying, all right, well, what are all the things we sold? What was the price for all of those things? Let's multiply the price times the quantity and add it all up. And that gives us nominal GDP. So you can see the equation here, NGDP equals the sum, that sigma means sum, of the price times the quantity for all of the goods and services, which could be, thousands and thousands of goods and services, right? The problem with nominal GDP is that it can go up or down either because quantities change, which is usually what we're interested in, or because prices have changed. And prices changing is what we're going to call inflation. But when we're looking at GDP, we'd like to control for that. And so what real GDP does, anything we say is real in macroeconomics, means that we're controlling for the price change. We're controlling for inflation. And the way we do that is that we choose a base year and we use the prices from that year in calculating real GDP. So if we're using 2010 as our base year, for example, then we'll use, if we're calculating 2013 GDP, we'll use 2013 quantities. How much did we produce in 2013? But we'll use 2010 prices. And that way, when we're comparing GDP in 2012 and 2013, we know that any change is due to a change in output rather than a change in price because we're controlling for the prices. So that allows us to compare real GDP across time, right? We can see, is real GDP per capita going up in the United States? Is it going down like it does in a recession? It doesn't do a great job in allowing us to compare across countries. And so in order to compare across countries, we want to use a price level where the same price will buy the same amount of good or service, right? So in some places, housing is more expensive. In some places, food is more expensive. We'd like to try to balance that out. And so often when we're looking at cross-country comparisons, we'll use something called purchasing power parity prices, or PPP prices, and that allows us to better compare, say, GDP per capita in the United States with GDP per capita in France or China or Japan. So one of the little pieces of math that we will do in this class. There's not a whole lot of math in this class, but there is a little bit. Is calculating the growth rate. And so we want to know by what percent did something grow? And so we're going to do that for GDP, we're going to do it for inflation, but this works for anything, right? If you're a biology major, you might want to calculate how much the bacteria in the petri dish grew. If you're a demographer, you might want to calculate the percent growth of population in the city. So if there's any variable x, the percent change is just the change in x, right? Or this year, xt minus last year, xt minus 1, divided by last year, xt minus 1, and then sometimes we multiply that by 100 just to put it in percentage terms. So let's do a quick example here. So in the second quarter of 2016, real GDP using 2009 dollars, so it's real GDP, not nominal GDP, was $51,580. And that had grown to $52,296 in the second quarter of 2017. So remember, that measures all of GDP, how much we produced in that year divided by the population. And so if we want to do the growth rate, we just do the value in 2017 minus the value in 2016 divided by the value in 2016. So that's 52,296 minus 51,580 divided by 51,580, or 716 divided by 51,580, which gives us 0.01388, which is 1.4%. So what we see is that these GDP growth rates really started to take off. Now let's look at this graph. This is the same graph we looked at before, but with a slight difference. So now on the vertical axis, instead of having a linear scale, which is what we're usually used to, where each distance represents the same value, now we have what's called a ratio scale or logarithmic scale, where each distance doubles the value. So we start at 250, we go to 500, then we double to 1,000, we double to 2,000, we double to 4,000, etc. And the benefit of a logarithmic scale is that a straight line gives us a constant growth rate. And so we can see that there was some significant differences before about 1650. Japan was the poorest country, Italy was the richest country, and China and Britain were somewhere in the middle. And then around 1650, Britain really started to grow. And then Italy started to grow, and then Japan started to grow, and then it's only really in the last 50 to 100 years, and really specifically in the last 30 to 40 years, that China and India have started to grow. So keep in mind whether you're looking at a ratio scale on the vertical axis or a linear scale. So the timing of growth is both interesting and gives us some clues about what's necessary for growth. We can see that Britain started to grow around 1650. We'll talk about that more in chapter 2. In Japan, it started around 1870, and in China and India, it happened, more recently in the second half of the 20th century. In a lot of places, that were under colonial rule, that has hindered their growth, with a couple possible exceptions, and other sort of interference by either European or American countries has also sort of slowed growth in some areas, and so we'll talk about that later as well.